So hello, welcome back to the genealogy season of Core Enaction. This is the concluding session, which we decided to dedicate to discussion. And I would like to very briefly introduce this session simply by thanking all the participants, all the invited speakers. This evening we have with us Professor Bruno Clarke, Professor Thompson. I would like to thank everybody for engaging so intensely in making very creative this exercise of creative foresight that we intended this genealogy to be. This evening, to start the discussion, we would like to propose to you some breakout groups, the breakout group session of, let's say, 50 minutes. Indeed, we received questions from some of the participants, in particular from Chris and from Juan Manuel. These are very deep, complex questions, so we were hoping through the breakout groups to encourage more basic questions so that we can progressively arrive to address the questions also proposed by Chris and Juan Manuel. So I think maybe Joanna, we can start. Joanna, we can start with the breakout groups.
So I'll launch the breakout rooms, and there will be between 3 and 4 people in a room. And so feel free just to launch right in. Again, you'll have about 15 minutes. I'll give you a warning in about when you have 5 minutes left and about a minute left, so we can all come back together in the main room. Okay.
So see you in 15 minutes.
See you in 15 minutes. And we just had a question, what is the task? So basically, we're just taking some time to discuss in small groups. Any questions, reflections that have come up for you that you might want to then share with the larger group for the collective discussion.
It might be useful to have a designated sharer or note taker.
Yes.
Someone to report back, that'd be great. Yeah.
Joanna, maybe I can go into the groups to repeat that. What do you think? I can switch from one group to the other, simply to...
I missed going into a group. How do I do that?
Maybe me too.
You should have an invitation.
Yeah, you should have a prompt that says join. I think, Amy, you're in room 5.
But it disappeared. It disappeared.
Okay, let's see.
Amy, if you click on breakout rooms, that icon below the screen, you can choose. Actually, you can go there to room 5 and join directly.
Okay. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
And then anyone else can do the same.
It's on.
And we can enter and exit the rooms. So maybe I can make a tour and make it more clear the task.
We just lost in our breakout group, Luis, in the middle of a very, very interesting question discussion.
Yes. Yes. I went through 2 free groups to try to make more clear the task and stuff, but we didn't. There were already going on discussions, very interesting discussions. So I have a good vibe about what can emerge now.
Actually, Evan, do you want to start with your group, maybe in Luis's discussion? Do you want to bring the question into the discussion maybe into the larger room to start off with?
So
Luis would need to do that because he was in the middle of describing it, and I couldn't summarize it myself.
Okay, well, I will try to end very quickly. I was talking about the rounds that the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, a political group from Argentina, did in the 70s and continues to do even today. And I was saying that coming from the arts, these collective devices that suddenly appear just for responding to stressful situations, in the arts, I have been witnessing the fact that we are trying to use a lot of the concepts coming from Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, Di Paolo, just for mentioning some of them, Enactive's approach to talk about these knowledges that are useless in general terms because they can be measured in the way how they are sustaining memories, for example, or social activities that can be seen, they are invisible, I will say. And we were talking before, and Alejandra was saying before, that sometimes it's very difficult to see how to move the concepts of the seminar to the social sciences or the human experiences or the human phenomenon in general. And I was talking about the arts as some sort of techniques through which maybe we can move these concepts and to see different applications to them, for them.
That's a huge question, and probably one of the central questions of this series. Maybe you want to, I don't know if you want to sort of riff on that, Evan and Bruce and Luisa, if you have some thoughts about that just initially, or if some other participants are grappling with this very same issue. Feel free to step in.
Maybe I'll start by saying some things. So I think it depends what the question and interest is. I personally don't think that we should think of enactive concepts or more generally the sort of concepts that were prior to enaction, but that were formative for it, concepts like autopoiesis and autonomy and things like that. I don't think we should think of those concepts as ones that need to be literally translated into and applied onto, say, artistic practice, for example. I think artistic practices and artistic bodies of knowledge are extremely rich in their own terms and already have their own implicit know-how and their own theorizing. And so for me, it would be a question of whether those concepts are useful or inspirational, maybe would even be a better way to put it, in the artistic domain. And I don't think that should be addressed in terms of what we can measure or what the use of something is. I think use value is only one kind of value. Some things are ends in themselves, and some things are both ends in themselves, and they can also serve other purposes. So in the case of that kind of political demonstration, of course, it's in the service of a larger social statement, but as a moment, it's an end in itself. It's a bearing witness to something collectively and for the sake of historical memory. So I don't think that the value of that or the importance of that is a function of measurement at all. That said, there are a number of things from a scientific perspective. Of course, you could come in and measure if you wanted to. It would be extremely disruptive to the event to try to do something like that, I think. But from that a certain outside analytic perspective, there's all sorts of things involving entrainment and synchrony and sort of collective pattern stabilization, things you could study. But the idea that would be getting at what the meaning of the event is in its social historical context, I think would be to confuse levels of analysis or domains of discourse or domains of meaning. So that's how I would look at a situation like that.
Evan, I'm wondering whether you would want to address Alejandra's question that you heard in our breakout group as well. And maybe we can just invite Alejandra to recap her question, because that was somewhat related, but although it was asked on a different level.
Thank you. My internet is extremely unstable. I've been thrown out like twice already. So if I'm not here in the next few minutes, Evan can talk for me, please. No, what I was commenting in a more general statement had something to do with what Luis was saying. It related to the idea that we've talked about bacteria, and we've talked about multicellular organisms, and we've talked about colonies. And there has been here and there some indications to where a concept such as autopoiesis would have significant value in terms of allowing an interpretation of some of what's going on versus things where apparently, and I know that at least I think it was stated a couple of times, Varela at least was not for the idea of moving these concepts from one domain to the other in a very metaphorical way even. But I was asking in specifically in relationship to the idea of the living as producing sense and producing its environment, where could we put where could we apply this idea? In what level of complexity of the living? So we've got the bacteria and we've got the human beings, but there's a lot going on in between. So wondering how to understand the idea of living beings producing their environment in this gradient of complexity, something like that.
Yeah, that's a very rich question. So the way that I see that is that if we're talking about concepts like autopoiesis and organization and autonomy, the ones you mentioned in the breakout group, I really see those concepts as having been initially developed in a very specific setting, which is to characterize, well, the way Maturana put it in the quotation I gave at the beginning of my talk, is to characterize the autonomy of the living, where now the concept of autonomy is obviously a big concept, as you said in the breakout group, but one that's, at least in the biological context, rooted in the idea of the living being as self-organizing, as organizing itself in a materially self-productive, organized self-productive way. So the question about the autonomy of the living was really then the context for the initial development of these concepts, and then a second move is made, which is to focus on the minimal case, which is now the individual cell, the simplest individual cell structurally, and the earliest historically being the bacterial cell. So that's kind of the initial context. But then as the concepts get elaborated, a way of thinking about, well, actually Maturana already made this linkage, a way of thinking about, say, cognition in the case of the multicellular organism with the nervous system is developed as an elaboration of that. And this is related to the question about closure we also had in the breakout group. So those are sort of the paradigm cases. In the nervous system case, I think, talking about meaning making and sense making and constructing the environment is actually in many ways easier to see than perhaps in the bacterial case, because things that we just take for granted, like our experience of space as having an up and down and a left and a right and a backwards and forwards, that whole sort of egocentric way that we inhabit space is a result of our having a certain body and a nervous system that you could say configures or enacts the domain of perceptual space, or the way we experience time. That, of course, is something that Francisco worked on a lot in linking neurobiology to phenomenology. The way we experience things in a structured way as a present, with a flowing away into the past side and an opening into the future side, that can be related to all sorts of things having to do with neural rhythms and creating windows of presence. So that kind of, the world of space and time that we inhabit is brought forth through the workings of the nervous system. But then where I think these concepts, at least as I would see it, need further development, and we shouldn't think of the development as just trying to apply them in some like linear, straightforward way to history or society, they need further development to be related to the specificity of things like we are the kinds of living beings that aren't just normative, but that can conceptualize ourselves as normative, can raise the question of what our norms should be, can act so as to act self-consciously and act socially so as to pursue certain norms. And the idea that you could just take a concept like autopoiesis or autonomy and just apply it to that phenomenology without a whole lot of work drawing in other concepts and tools just, seems to me not to be productive at all. So the way that I see these concepts is ones where they open up certain ways of looking at things, but then in each domain you have to draw in the specificity of the historian's perspective or the anthropologist's perspective or the Earth system scientist's perspective, if we're talking about, what Margulis and Lovelock called Gaia. So that's the way that I look at these things. And I think that's more or less the way Francisco looked at them too. I think his hesitancy about, or not just hesitancy, his refusal to just take the concepts and apply them to society was that he was very sensitive to these complexities, particularly to the one that when we apply them to ourselves, we're not just describing things, we're actually engaged in an act of self-constitution where we then constitute ourselves conceptually as autonomous systems or as having, closure affected through social relations. And that's not a description anymore. That becomes a performance. And that means it's a political act. It's a social political act, which is contestable.
And now you're back to the art activism,
right?
Perhaps that Luis brought up.
Exactly.
I've been searching for a point of entry, and there's a lot on the table right now. But it struck me that Alejandra's question got me to thinking about the place of cognition in the overall in the architecture of the theories that we're looking at, and how we can and how we're included in an overall schema that sort of that makes inseparable the autopoietic production at whatever level or scale we conceptualize that, and the emergence of cognition as a result, or as a process that's entirely concomitant with the ongoing self-production of life. So this philosophy gives us a way to think about cells as cognitive at some minimal and yet absolutely crucial level, and so that's the minimal case. But there's a sense in which, at least in my notion of the philosophical elaboration of the idea that cognition then is where the observation is headed. Or in other words, what I'm trying to say is that we human beings who cognize in our own very sort of specific and complex way and linguistically mediated way, for all that, we're still just we're just doing what our cells do in a more physiologically elaborated way, and so the conceptuality. So as we conceive of our own phenomenological experience as a sense-making process, that's life and mind. Autopoiesis is the life and cognition is the mind, and it's that continuity that we're trying to conceptualize, fundamentally through through this body of work that we're looking at. I can stop there. Or can...
I'm sure we'll have time to circle back to this too. Carson, you had your hand up. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm probably piggybacking a little bit on Lewis coming from the artistic perspective. I mean, there is an interrelation that happens between the body, mind, and an environment that is an interlooping, a social, like a circular casualty, and sometimes, like in these discussions of the autopoietic and the autonomous systems, I just find a little bit of a disconnect between the fact that, you know, a human organism can have an autopoietic system and an autonomous system, but as Varela suggested, that once a human, because they're engaged in the social cognitive realm, cannot be that. And then I'm curious, which is kind of going into an active perception, but like I find maybe the interest or the problematic situation, it is that interaction between like the autopoietic system and the autonomous system that also engages in a world that doesn't always kind of combine, like doesn't conform to that. Because when we're in social, cultural, environment situations, we're going to change our relation to that environment. And then once we start to engage with tools and technologies, that goes even further. And so I think there's this dynamical relation. And I guess that's kind of like some of the concepts that have been brought up. Like, I don't know, like this is kind of my consideration, how to articulate it, how to consider it further, while also giving agency to that, like the arts has actually also studied this for many, many centuries, maybe not from the same terminological perspective, but this has been, especially coming from different regions of the world, this has been a topic of interest, not always expressed the same way, but it's part of the philosophical or social and cultural development of the language to talk about it.
I think it might actually just be worth that was a very, very interesting comment and observation, and it just made me think that it might be worth noting that, I mean, we're in a way talking about sort of the genealogy of Enaction and things prior to Enaction, but the concept of Enaction, of course, it has an artistic content as well as a legal content, as well as a content just having to do with action. So it's already, just in the word, the English word at any rate, it already has all those resonances built into it, and I think that is a kind of richness that makes it open to different kinds of elaborations. And indeed, actually, I wrote an introduction to a book on the phenomenology of acting by Philip Zerilli, who passed away a couple of years ago. And he took up the concept of Enaction, initially inspired by the embodied mind, but then he already had an extremely rich practice, coming from physical theater, going back to Grotowski, in which there's a whole concrete practice and theory of Enaction, in our terminology, in the artistic domain. And so he took it up and used it in a way that related it to that history. So that's almost like traveling full circle. It's the concept starts out in this way where the idea of action is really the emphasis, and then but it's already an artistic concept in a way. It gets taken up and elaborated in the arts, or in that particular context of theater, and gets a whole new life, then feeds back into thinking about action and embodiment as well from a scientific perspective. So that's really a kind of mutual circulation in the way that we use that terminology in the embodied mind. And we focused in the embodied mind on a particular kind of mutual circulation involving phenomenology and also involving Buddhism. But I certainly see the mutual circulation as one that has a whole other life feeding in and out of the arts, that intersects with, you know, things like phenomenology as well. So it's, for me, it's like there are these different ramifications and pathways that can be explored. And they don't all have to add up to one sort of coherent, unified theory or model, as I see it. I mean, I'm sort of a pluralist in that way.
I'll jump in real quick just to observe how my sense of enaction as we enact it in the particular human way that we enact, we bring forth our worlds, right? Enaction is about the fact that that's how worlds emerge for us. One way or another, we bring them forth, and we can either do that unconsciously of that being the fact, or in the knowledge that that is the fact, and that's art. Or at least one way that would happen would be artistic creation. Just saying, I'm going to bring forth a new object of some sort, or you know, a new reflection in some medium. And I'm wondering then if this doesn't get at Chris's question that was pre-circulated with regard to the concept of novelty, and Chris was asking, do we have an account, or can we get a satisfying account of something new coming into the world, which is often in the discourse of autopoiesis, or in the misunderstanding of autopoiesis, there's a concern with regard to the return of the same and just going around in circles, which I think is, you know, we can get beyond that conceptually, but it then, so it has to do with the affordances of cognition for us are broad, right? And that is, but we're still having to bring the world forth in some fashion or another. But I think that process is not locked into repetition in any necessary way. In other words, novelty really is the default state of, even if we kind of then take, you know, sort of don't recognize the sort of the pure event unfolding as different from what's been. But so that's my sense, is that the enactive philosophy is comprehends a kind of continuous renewal, a sense of at least the possibility of continuously renewing the world through our acts. Chris, is that anything like what you were thinking through?
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's very much the spirit of my question. It's funny, I'm feeling a little under the weather, of course, the last couple of days, and I'm a little foggy. But it initially started with me trying to, the main thrust of what I got from Jonas was the idea that and he even says so, that everything is forward facing, that life is forward moving. And so I think if you account, you know, you take an autopoietic system or a circular system, self-reference system, and you add in the arrow of time, and you add in forward motion, and, you know, this energy being turned over and transformed, and it's accumulating. And so is that then an account for the formation of novelty, right? That it's almost like given that you're going to get, you know, something new generated from that process. that the circularities, it will never return to the same place because we're always going forward, right? I think that's the general thing. But just now what was coming to mind was that Francisco, that he made a distinction between knowledge and wisdom. And I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts on, what we're talking about, artistic creation and wisdom versus, just sort of reductionism and knowledge in the Western sense, that, maybe there's something there. So.
I want to say something about novelty. The wisdom question is a good one too, but the novelty one I think is worth spending a little time on, because I think it enables us to think a little bit more in a nitty-gritty way about some of the inspirational concepts of autopoiesis and autonomy, inspirational for the enactive approach. I think that so autopoiesis, let's say as classically defined, I don't think really is illuminating for novelty at all. I think, autopoiesis is basically all or none. The system is either autopoietic or it isn't. And any intermediate zone where it's dying, as we would say, belongs to the domain of the observer. It's just an observer relative description, because from the perspective of specifying the autopoietic organization, the organization is either present or it isn't. And Maturana himself says in the Biology of Cognition paper, he says that autopoietic systems are cognitive systems because they cyclically return to states that maintain the organization, and seen in relationship to the environment, that amounts to a kind of inductive predicting of how the environment is or is unfolding in a way that enables this return, this kind of cycling through states that continue that organization. And so I don't think that there's really any sense of novelty there at all. And I think in the way that that Francisco's work evolved, that in the biological domain, novelty comes into play when Francisco starts talking about what he called metadynamical systems. So looking at, say, how the immune system alters its own dynamics as a result of its history and its particular trajectory, you could say, developmentally, or how the nervous system modifies its own connectivity. Now we know, even through neurogenesis, the development of new cells in an experience-dependent way. So all of that has to do with history and novelty and an accumulation of experience, which isn't just cycling back through, if we want to think of it behaviorally or phenomenologically, through the same experiences. So if you think of something like learning a second language when you're 45, or suffering trauma as a result of being invaded and having to flee your country, and then putting your life together anew, as we would say, that those kinds of radical reformations, those kinds of things I don't see as really within the, so they are part of the vision of life, you could say, very broadly understood from the enactive perspective, but they're not really provided for in the classical kind of articulations of concepts like autopoiesis and autonomy. And that's part of what's behind Ezekiel Di Paolo's introduction of the concept of adaptivity of the system, monitoring its own activity in relation to its conditions of viability. But even there, that's not enough, because basically what's going on there is a registration of tendencies toward the edge of viability and then compensatory behaviors to move away from it. But in the case of novelty, the viability boundary itself actually changes. It's not the same viability boundary. And that's not really provided for in the bare bones logic of the concept of adaptivity. Now, I mean, Ezekiel Di Paolo and Hannah Dieger and Elena Kufari, they're very concerned with novelty in the Linguistic Bodies book, with the way that we acquire new sensory motor habits and the way we acquire language. And so novelty is very much in sight in that book. but it's still at a level of, you might say, concepts and conceptual metaphors. It's not really operationally specified in scientific detail. And I don't think it's maybe operationally specified in scientific detail anywhere. It's kind of an edge of investigation right now, where the idea would be that the biological steady state, as it were, is constant change, as Bruno was saying. And so what needs to be explained, if you take constant change as your baseline, is stability. It's a bit like, Galileo and Newton make inertial motion the baseline, and then you explain deviations or changes from that as a result of outside forces acting on it. So from a biological perspective, the idea would be that you make change, constant change, cell division, reproduction, constant change in the body as the baseline. And then you have to explain how stability, like, a stable body plan through development, or stability of, many body plans, but a certain limited number through evolution, that becomes the explanatory target, with the assumption of constant change and novelty as the baseline. And that's like a complete conceptual shift that we don't have the math for, really. We haven't been thinking that way. So there are people working on that. Actually, a group in Paris that in particular is working on that from the sort of mathematics and biology angle. But that's really a radically new way of thinking, I would say, in the history of science, that's very much in keeping with, I think, an enactive orientation, which emphasizes process and change as the sort of base condition. So that's how I see novelty as fitting into the story.
Is it okay if I jump back in just to make a point or two? Well, I agree. The classical description is about as bare bones as a description can be when it comes to autopoiesis. It's about 2/3 of the page. So I realized in listening to you now that my own thinking is, I guess it's because I'm kind of been using the Gaian, been trying to think with Gaian concepts as Lynn Margulis insisted that it made sense to talk about something called autopoietic Gaia. So, and so I've been trying to, but she didn't really, she only left suggestions. She didn't write up a treatise on that topic or anything at all. So, but the way here's how I understand absolute novelty at the biological level in terms of the concept of autopoiesis. It's simply this. It means that in any real context of an actual living organism, from the cell on up, that metabolism, right? Because metabolism is the instantiation of the autopoietic organization. And metabolism, and this is where Chris was, when Chris said, but you've got the arrow of time. Now, that's basically, another way to say that is that entropy is moving through the cosmos, or that living systems have to have to live out their term of existence in terms of the laws of thermodynamics, from which there's no escape. But but the newer understanding is that that's actually, it's that these energy transformations that life is bound up in is part of how it taps off organization from entropy. And so that's part of what, so stability, operational stability is a kind of, is what is won through the living organization from the gradient reduction of energies moving through systems. Now, the other thing is that all metabolic systems take in matter, take in energy and matter, and the matter passes through the system. Some of it is retained for rebuilding the living system altogether, And what isn't needed for that is basically excreted to the environment. But what it means is that living systems have always been churning the material world through their living processes and depositing their wastes into the world, and gradually you get a new world. In other words, life is always changing the environment in which it carries out its processes incrementally over geological time, so that you have and so from, and what these dynamics then add up to the evolutionary vector of the change of life over geological time, as well as the more sort of momentary eventuality of a system whose environment is always changing pretty much by in some fashion, in some parameter, and life wins its constancy out of that confrontation. So there, I don't know, there's a pocket of novelty in that process, it seems to me, that we tap off of as life ramps up from its minimal occasions. In other words, it's always from eon to eon, it's a new Gaia, it's a new biota, and we're caught up in ultimately in these trends of cosmological change.
And we're now affecting it through anthropogenic climate change.
That's part of the big picture for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, Chris, I know you still have your second question waiting about wisdom and knowledge. We were going to take a short 5-minute break. Would you be okay if we take the break now and then come back right to your question? Yep. Okay. So why don't we come back at about 7:05, 7:06, and just so people can have a bio break, and then we'll launch right into your second question. And then we will really make an effort to come back to some of the initial questions from the groups at the beginning, in case there are some more, basic questions that came out from those discussions. So see you back in just 5 minutes. So if everyone's coming back in the next minute or so, we will get started again. Okay, great. Chris, do you want to just maybe take us back to your second question and just re-articulate that?
Well, I mean, it was it was pretty general on the distinction between knowledge and wisdom. What I had in mind, and Juan Manuel and me were talking in the breakout group a little bit. I was almost there when we got out of the breakout group. But it was something like, and I had mentioned, Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed notion of generating, basically getting away from replicating, something previous and generating something new by creating a real conversational domain. And that, society itself is constructed in a way that generates wisdom and doesn't just, that we can, if we stay in the conversational domain, that we can break sort of the maintenance of power and the reification of old ideas and accumulation, and that where everybody has a real say in what's going on, and that's my take on what it means to have wisdom situated in in the social system, and I think that's, to my understanding, is that's how we get from the autopoietic autonomy to social autonomy, and that's where I was going with that. So
I think that I don't know if you can jump in.
Yep, absolutely, go for it.
I think that one of the problems is that there you just going into the political arena, and I think that is interesting, because it's not just like conversation happens. Conversation doesn't happen. Have to be in a way we should be forced to speak with each other, especially in the political arena, which means that I'm not talking about political parties. I'm talking about, somebody is excluded of the conversation, I have to jump in. So I was wondering, there are different levels, historically about how was formulated autopoiesis. And my feeling, due to the history of, how autopoiesis was presented and the political interventions that Varela and Maturana had during their lives, that there are certain versions of autopoiesis that are politically controversial. There are certain ambiguities that I think that you can read you could say the corrections, in the last decades from a political point of view, which is related specifically to what Chris was explaining now about this difference between knowledge and wisdom. Wisdom seems to me that there is some radical novelty. And this radical novelty comes into existence when something from outside, that have to be acknowledged, comes in, and there is a recognition. And so it's not about intrinsic purpose only in the sense of the way in which the subject or the agent is interpreting. It's something that is coming from outside that demand, some sort of acknowledgement. And so for me, it's very important. I'm coming from a different background. I'm not coming from the natural sciences. I'm coming from political philosophy, basically, and sociology. For me, theory, is coherent if epistemology and politics fit together. If there is some kind of homology, this is something basic, especially in political philosophy. Plato have his theory of the soul, and he wanted that the polis was somehow a mirror of the soul. And you can make an analogy in all the political philosophers in the history, of the West, and obviously as well in the East, you will find something like that, like Arjuna explaining in Ratnavali, something very similar, going from epistemology, the theory of the subject, and so forth, and trying to propose some sort of community. So my question, which is related, I think, about to Christ's thinking is, there is, Luisa was explaining at the beginning, she was proposing in the first session about the possibility that, the whole bunch of theories and ideas and so forth could be some sort of answer to the crisis of the present. Something very important. I feel connected with this idea, but the question is, what sort of implication, especially those who are very much into it, you can recognize about autopoiesis in the political field, in the sense, not the translation, not the implications in the sense that how we can apply. I'm not interested about that, because I am very much agree with Evan explanation about arts. We shouldn't apply, but we can understand that certain theories always have an implication in different domains. If you have an idea in biology, you will have a translation in the political arena, in the economic arena, and so forth. And we saw that in the history of autopoiesis. For example, everything that happens in Chile. So, what are the implications? And if we shouldn't pay more attention, not only about the applications of the theory, but also that we will end up translating for other people certain political views about the world. And autopoiesis is very powerful and can be very destructive as well if it's misinterpreted. This is my feeling, that we have to put a lot of attention, because, for example, very briefly, there is one biographical story that Bruno Clarke explained about the 1970s and 1980s. You know, there were two completely different programs that were applied in Chile. One was a communist program, you know, from Salvador Allende, the Cinco program, that in which intervened, you know, Varela and Maturana. And then in the 1980s, there was a seminar that was given in Chile as well. And they were both two completely different views about social reality, about the concept of individuality, about the concept of sociality, and so forth and so on. So there is some kind of ambiguity that always science bring about to the political field. And I want to know how we should deal with this ambiguity. That's my question regarding this idea, and the place of teleology as an intent to solve the problem of this ambiguity. And the other point is that if the idea of intrinsic purpose shouldn't be explained in a more, you know, I don't say that it's anti-realistic in the present moment, but in a more, with emphasizing the realistic aspect, in the sense of being conquered by reality in certain moments in which we need great transformations. I don't know if I make sense about what I try to say.
Maybe I'll add some thoughts. It's a very interesting series of questions and reflections. And I mean, it opens up many different possible avenues of discussion. One thing that I would raise as a question is, and this is going to reflect my way of looking at things as a philosopher, is that there's certainly, as a matter of historical contingency, historical situatedness, links between the work on autopoiesis and various political movements and political events, particularly in the Chilean context. It's not clear to me what, if any, the necessary conceptual or logical connections between those things are. That is to say that, you know, Maturana and Varela were individuals with their various, you know, political perspectives and views, their various experiences, you know, in the 1960s and the 1970s in Chile. There was a certain moment of enthusiasm for, you know, a possible changes, maybe sometimes articulated in utopian ways. Then, of course, there was the coup. There was Francisco's, you know, personal experience of that and the crisis that posed for him, that he talks about in the reflections on the Chilean Civil War piece, the lecture that he gave in the 1970s, where there seems to me a very deep, I don't know if skepticism is the right word, but maybe that is the word, skepticism about the political as a domain in which wisdom and transformation are possible, given the dysfunction in individuals that then he eventually came to understand in Buddhist terms. And although, you know, Francisco was always a very, you know, political thinker in certain ways, there is a way in which you can understand that as a retreat is not the right word, but a certain kind of withdrawal from a certain way of thinking about politics and political engagement in a way that places the emphasis on personal transformation, because without the personal transformation, the political project is thought not to be possible. I mean, that I won't say that summarized his view, but that became an element in his thinking, I think. So for me, that there is a question about what exactly the relationship is between concepts like autopoiesis and biological autonomy and the political. There's of course the historical question, but then there's the logical conceptual issue of what the relationship is between them. In the case of autonomy, well, we know that that's, you know, an originally political concept. So of course the political content is very deep in the way of thinking about, you know, the Athenian city-state and the, you know, the Platonic conception of the soul, as you mentioned, and of course up through Kant with you know, the idea of a person as an end in themselves and a society that needs to be maximized to recognize that. So the things are deeply conceptually connected in the case of autonomy, but autopoiesis is very tricky because autopoiesis is not put forward initially as a political concept. It's put forward as a concept that's meant to be specifically scientific and biological, and it stands or falls in that domain initially, at any rate. And then it gets taken up and elaborated in different ways that ally it to different political sensibilities and different political ideas. But I've never been really persuaded by those links, if it's just autopoiesis that we're talking about, because they always seem to me to involve leaps, logical leaps, rather than really rigorous working out of connections. So that would be my initial reaction there. I mean, I would also say that these questions come up. I mean, Bruno can talk about this. These questions also come up in thinking about Gaia and the Gaia theory, which initially is meant to be a scientific theory about the Earth as a systemic whole, but immediately, of course, has all sorts of political ramifications and political linkages that are not agreed upon by the founders of that theory either, for that matter. I mean, just as Maturana and Varela don't agree about autopoiesis, you know, Lovelock and Margulis don't agree about how to think of the political ramifications of Gaia. And indeed, you know, now today, in terms of Earth system science, this is shot through, obviously, with all sorts of political considerations. But I still there would be hesitant to think that our model should be the one that you invoked, which is this kind of isomorphism of, you know, the Platonic soul and the city-state, or the, you know, the Kantian free autonomous agent and the liberal democratic society. I find that the attempts to find those kinds of isomorphisms to underpin political work very, very problematic. They require steps and leaps that I don't think are logically rigorous and that are politically dangerous, actually, I think. I mean, that would be my initial reaction, just really totally off the top of my head. I don't mean to say that this is like a worked out line of thought. This is a conversation where we're all thinking out loud, but that would be my initial reaction.
Can I jump one just very briefly? No, but my surprise was when, for the introduction of cybernetics, you know, because cybernetics is quite problematic in many different manners, you know, and one of these is that cybernetics was the moment in which was discussed, you know, was a very particular moment in history. It was the moment in which we were discussing two models of society: total planification and total market. This was, and the participants on the conferences were the most important people of these two camps, you know. So, and I don't think that there is a direct relationship between politics and epistemology, or not at all. But yes, we have in the history of thought, you know, relationships that come out. Even the authors that they didn't think about it, but they came out with certain consequences. For example, the case, the most obvious case is Hume. You know, he have a contradictory, you know, idea about his doctrine, social doctrine, and then he has his epistemology or his theory of subjectivity, and he had to give up one of them in a certain way, and he decided that sympathy and custom was more important than his theory of the subject, finally. You know, in a certain way, we could interpret it in this way. I know that many people don't. But what I tried to say I was surprised when Bruno explained the story of cybernetics, because there later on in the life of Maturana and the life of Varela, they were participating. This is not something against their theory, and then there is some connection about, and I think that is related to utopianism. That is something that, again, Juan Carlos de Telia in his presentation was quite, for me, was a little bit amazing. This idea that you can mathematize or describe completely, for example, the structural coupling, they work in that idea, which is quite completely crazy, I mean, you are talking about something like artificial intelligence. There is some analogy between these in this kind of projects, and they are utopian projects. We are going to change completely the reality. We are going to be able to plan the whole organization of society. We could understand completely the relationship with this idea. And for this was my question: what are the implications, in the different phases of the theory of autopoiesis, how it was expressed? In each case, what could be the implications in each one of those periods of development of the theory of autopoiesis? I think that the first one was very problematic, and then when the introduction of teleology is something from my side welcoming, and I think that if the next move is not just to introduce a new aspect, which is not very clear for me, especially coming from liberation philosophy, there's the idea of the otherness in a stronger manner, that the other, the one that is outside of the circle of our perception, apprehension of the world, can move us to real transformation.
I'll quickly say something, and then I want to let other people talk. But I think from the very beginning, with the way that the theory of autopoiesis is set up, such that then we have the addition of concepts like adaptivity and at least in Francisco's case, a turn towards an embrace of teleology that that Maturana always refused. Throughout that, there's always been a problem of the status of the other and the recognition of the other, because the theory has been devised from the beginning to specify an organization of an individual as the reference point, and to define sense-making and adaptivity and teleology from that reference point. So then immediately you have the question of the status of what exceeds that, the status of what can't be met with on those terms, that requires recognition from its side, you could say. And Francisco actually introduced, in a way, Enaction in part to deal with that issue. The way that arose was, the accusation that the autopoietic perspective can't help but lead to a certain kind of, you could say, solipsism, a certain kind of prioritizing or making the individual defined in terms of organizational closure the ultimate point of reference, and then the world and the other, they're lost sight of. And so Enaction was meant as a way to try to move beyond that formulation, because the emphasis was on action, and action that is situated in an environment that is, of course, relative to the action, but also exceeds it, and that includes other actors. And so there's a footnote, actually, in I think the Spanish edition of the reissuing of the autopoiesis text, where Francisco has his own introduction, where I think he actually, it's not a footnote, I think it's part of the text, where he mentions this kind of shift in his perspective from autopoiesis to Enaction. And it's clear that those kinds of issues are what's at stake there. Not to say that they're worked out in a fully satisfactory way, but that's the problem that emerges. So I see that myself now as crucial in the transition from what I might call autopoetic thinking to enactive thinking, which has to do with sociality and intersubjectivity and the status of the other. So I think it's extremely important.
I was just going to add, and Juan Manuel was referencing back to, I believe, to my presentation and the particular line of cybernetic thought that goes through Heinz von Förster and is significant for Varela's working through the concept of autopoiesis in the larger milieu of von Förster's work in the biological computer lab, and Heinz actually, my essay in Emergence and Embodiment, new essays on second order systems theory, takes up the very problem of solipsism, because Heinz, as having sort of come into a constructivist conviction, epistemological conviction, in his own right, realized the problem of solipsism that posed in sort of as a traditional philosophical issue and so he worked, you see in Heinz's own papers, an effort to arrive at intersubjectivity on the model of individual self-production. And so Heinz told me the one time I had the chance, and I give also in that publication, I'll just mention I have an interview with Heinz, a redacted interview with Heinz, and one thing he says is that Varela told him that his most important paper, well, I think he thought altogether, was a paper from about 1973 called Objects, Tokens for Eigenbehaviors. And this is it's hugely, well, it's hard to describe, but the point, the connection here is that where that paper goes is exactly to the problem of putting of a social dyad where each self is the immediate environment of the other self, and so you get and so he offers a diagram that he of not just the single Ouroboros, right, which is the kind of the logo of self-reference and operational closure, but it's one Ouroboros, it's two Ouroboroi, and one is eating the tail of the other. Okay, so it's not eating its own tail to close the circle, it's eating the tail of the other, and so you get a double circle of two minds in sort of intimate interaction, and so I think it was that so that the overcoming of the seeming finite closure around a monadic individual is something that's being worried about in the context of constructivist epistemology by someone like Heinz von Förster, and I think, and by my reading, I'm satisfied he showed kind of how to get out of that trap, and that the discourse of autopoiesis can avail itself of some of Heinz's strategies. My sense is that Varela saw that and valued that in Heinz's work. And that would just be, to get back to Juan Manuel, sure, there's all kinds of bad or politically problematic cybernetics, but it's exactly not the line of cybernetics that goes through the biological computer lab. Biological computer lab was, most you could say, was like a hotbed of sort of anarchistic, or on the, you know, but, well, that's a whole other thing, but social, the Bakunin strain of the open society, of free agents working out communal arrangements. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you. I'm aware we have less than a half an hour left at this point, and we have a lot of different questions. I do see your hand, Carson, but I just want to turn to Murillo because we haven't heard from him yet, and I know he had some overarching concerns and questions, which might bring us back actually to some of the main themes of the semester. So Murillo, do you want to maybe re-articulate at least your first two questions or comments?
Sure, I can try. So I'll okay. The first question I brought up was we're presented with the notion of autopoiesis, and we're trying to understand what it means so that we can then move forward to further topics. And autopoiesis is presented as a theory of what a living system is, but there's not much said about what a living system does. And I don't know if this is one aspect of what is meant by novelty. And maybe that's one aspect of what novelty could be, because it could be the structure or the organization of different forms of living systems, but it could also be what a living system does from time to time, which in other terms we could name as perception and action. So the first point I was bringing is in our conversations, we often go from this very abstract notion of autopoiesis to then jumping to talking about perception and action, interaction with the environment. And there seems to be something missing in this link. And if we, from a cognitivist perspective, this is often, that's often where the computational mind is brought in as a concept. And I cannot yet see the link clearly from the concept of autopoiesis to then discussing about perception and action. So that's topic one. And I'm sorry, I'm not clear because these things are confusing for me right now. I'll just let topic one because I'm sure other people have other things. I don't want to dominate.
We can start with that, yeah.
Actually, just to regroup a little bit, we had a question in group 5 that came up that might be part of this. It was a question about the difference between the input-output model and the self-referential model. So these are very basic questions about what we went through with Luisa and the group.
Well, that's a relatively straightforward one. I think conceptually, the last one that is, I think, not as difficult as the other issues on the table. But the input-output model would probably be, that would be your classic computational model of a computational device is given an instruction, and that's the input. And then churns out some solution to the equation, or in any event answers the question that's put to it, and that's the output. but also, for instance, heat engines. In other words, machines generally are thought of as, I mean, you put the fuel into the heat engine, you ignite it, you combust it, you get work, you get power for that you can then apply to your pistons, and so there's an energy input output is generally a form of, I mean, often you can watch energy move through a system, enter a system, move through it and move out, or information can go into a kind of data system, and then the computed answer, and then more data comes out the other. So the feedback as a central concern of cybernetics from the very inception is thinking how things completely change when the output is fed back in as new input. So that's the classical feedback model. So now the distinction between input and output has become indeterminate, because the output is not just going out and going away, it's coming back in to define what the system now does next as a basis of tracking its own output. And so this could just be a classical servo, like a thermostat, or some error correcting homeostatic process, but it's still a kind of system dynamic that depends on a self-reference of function, which is the returning of output as new input. Okay, and autopoiesis then takes that self-referential closure of the system upon its own operations to another level of instantiation, but it derives, at least in the cybernetic line of thought, it derives from that. It's an elaboration of the idea of feedback. So there's your historical frame for that. I hope that helped the asker that question.
Yeah, and that links directly to the question about the movement from autopoiesis at the unicellular level to questions about cognition, because that movement really has to do with the specificity of the nervous system. And so in the classical cognitivist or computational perspective, the brain is modeled as an input-output system with instructions and functions that are computed so as to produce an output, where classically the input is sensory and the output is motor. And the understanding of the nervous system as having organizational closure, so this is the appendix in autopoiesis and cognition, and then becomes a chapter in Principles of Biological Autonomy. The idea is that the nervous system or the brain is closed under the neuronal operations, where sensory influence now becomes treated as a kind of perturbing event for the ongoing self-generated, or what we today would call endogenous intrinsic activity of the nervous system. And the distinction between input and output really becomes arbitrary ultimately, because it depends, what you're going to count as, in a way, the baseline of activity, what you're going to count as sensory, what you're going to count as motor, which is always organized in this closed loop fashion, but now mediated through the tremendous self-affecting complexity of the nervous system. So of course you can, for certain purposes, you can model that in input-output terms and treat it in a sort of classical cognitivist computational way. But the minute you do that, you're really no longer modeling it in its proper autonomy or its proper operational closure, which then entails not treating it as an input-output system, because you don't really have inputs and outputs. You have you have endogenous activity and perturbations to that activity, both from coming from the body, but also coming from the rest of the body besides the brain, and coming from the environment.
You know, I also saw in the chat, maybe you had this ready to go, Joanna, a question about the difference between affectivity and sentience, which is a good question. And I don't have a refined answer to that, because affectivity is kind of, I think, the relatively mysterious term, but we just know as embodied beings that the ideas that flow through our minds are constantly enmeshed in feeling states that are not particularly specific to as far as their source, or just call it the soul, you know, in the sense of the somatic self, the complexity of the somatic self, at the interface between bodily response and mental intuition or representation. I don't know, Evan, would sentience comprehend that as part of as a synonym for the kind of cognition we're talking about? Would you, or would you draw a distinction there?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. I mean, the way that I think of sentience is at its core the feeling of being alive. There's a really fantastic passage in the beginning of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, where, you know, he's talking, the unnamed narrator is going through the experience of, you know, falling asleep and waking up, and at one moment in the sort of transition from being in deep sleep to waking up, he says all there was the feeling of existence as it quivers in the depths of the animal. So, you know, the sentiment de l'existence, I suppose, in French, the feeling of being as it you know, quivers in the depth of the living body. So that kind of that sense of sentience, as you, some people talk about core affect in science today, but that feeling of being, the feeling of being alive, that doesn't have to do with specific exteroceptive or even specific interoceptive contents. It, you know, it might be related to general things like energized or fatigued, sort of kind of very, very general bodily affective states. I think of that, and it's affectively valenced in one way or another, even if it's neutral. Neutral is sort of the 0 point between, you know, being valenced this way versus feeling valenced that way. That's really what I think of as sentience. And then, the question really is whether that is fundamental to life itself, even in the basic, you know, unicellular autopoietic case, or whether that requires, for reasons that I don't think we understand, whether that requires some further complexification or elaboration through the nervous system. And I've written an article on this that I put the link in chat, and I think you know, Francisco would talk about this in different ways at different times. Sometimes he would talk in a register or in an idiom that made sentience and life, you know, fundamentally intertwined with each other. Sometimes he would talk about consciousness in ways that would tie it more specifically to the nervous system. But I don't think of that kind of sentience as involving any sort of cognitive act of comprehension. It's a feeling of being, and that's distinct from all the sorts of things that then we would do cognitively with that feeling in one or another, you know, mental set, or that other animals might be capable of doing with it cognitively. But I do think it's a fundamental question whether that's sort of at the core of life. And I think it's reasonable to think that it's at the core of life, but I couldn't give you a sort of, demonstrative proof that it's at the core of life.
Unfortunately, we can't climb into another life form and walk a mile in its shoes to see. But it's nice to think that cells have the feeling of being, that there's a kind of do you folks know Cosme Comics by Italo Calvino? He has some stories in there where he imagines cells. The cells are the characters of the stories, and they have very, very vivid affective lives. But anyways, it's a more vibrant world if we posit a kind of pervasive sentience and tie it to this cognitive emergence that comes with bare autopoiesis at the inception.
Okay, so we have just a few more minutes left. I'd say about 6 or 7 minutes before we wrap up. And maybe in the last couple of minutes, we can just turn it back to Evan and Bruce to see if you have any just final snippets to share with us. Maybe we can end with Wolfgang, who had a question in the chat. And I apologize, Carson, I still see your hand. If you want to post your question, your second question in the Slack, we can get to that. And same for everyone else. If you still have questions coming up, please feel free to put them in the Slack, and we'll try to address them there. So Wolfgang, did you want to evoke your question?
Thank you. So I think with regards to something I heard you mention, Evan, about the shift towards an active thinking, that if I heard you well, you described that Francisco at some point made a shift from autopoietic towards an active thinking. So with regard to that shift, but even for any kind of understanding of all these concepts, I was wondering to which extent might there be something to perhaps even unlearn to be able to grasp the concepts or make such a shift, particularly about mental habits, about the notion of self, or, I mean, this would be what comes to my mind as a potential inhibiting or limiting factor in order to properly understand whatever that means, these concepts, or to make such a shift in thinking, and what kinds of practices, if any, perhaps contemplative practices, would be conducive to such a shift, or how has this already been experienced by you or by others who have or are in the way of making such a shift? I hope the question is understandable, but yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, there are definitely habits of thought that I think get in the way. Certain kinds of instrumental means end thinking, linear thinking that thinks that, there are determinate causes with determinate effects. That, I mean, certainly sometimes there are determinate causes with determinate effects, but making that the model for understanding complexity doesn't work. I'm reminded of an essay by Gregory Bateson on what he called conscious purpose and its effects on human adaptation. That was the title of the essay, where he singles out, and actually this is related to wisdom, the difference between knowledge and wisdom, because in that essay, Bateson basically says, he defines conscious purpose as a kind of limited consciousness that is in his words, skewed sample of the total field of events. So it's the idea that consciousness in the sense of ordinary awareness is selective, is exclusional, is filtering, and so only works with a very small sampling or selection of the complexity of the interdependent field of events, and then tries to instrumentalize that in terms of means ends procedures which on a large scale, is the kind of, in Bateson's perspective, is the kind of thinking and limitations of consciousness that lead to things like the climate crisis, among other things. That for Bateson, that's the most large scale manifestation of that particular habit of thought. And then Bateson very specifically says that wisdom is being sensitive to complexity and learning to think in a way that's not biased by those exclusions that happen, and doesn't immediately leap to apply a linear model with a means ends calculus. And in the very same essay, he actually links wisdom to love, where love, he doesn't mean, he means love in this, by love, what he really means is recognition of the other, actually, the status of the other. And he uses the word love for that. So it's not, love in a romantic sense or even in an immediate familial sense. And that's that's an ongoing effort. To think that there would be a recipe for that would be to immediately take means end thinking and apply it to trying to generate wisdom and love, which is obviously contradictory. So I think, there are many practices that can facilitate that depending on how they're done. Some kinds of contemplative practices in some kinds of situations. I don't think contemplative practice in and of itself is necessarily geared towards that, because contemplative practice is many things depending on tradition and context. Some kinds of artistic practice are obviously very sensitive to that and very important. But in terms of general habits of thought, those are the ones that I think require constantly working with the sort of biased exclusionary means and instrumental framework for everything, which we so easily fall into in our sort of cultural mindset of the past 300 years.
Bruno, did you want to say any final words in response to that? Oh, you're muted.
I was saying I find I'm not wise enough to answer that question, so I'm going to let it slide. But I would like to, in these final moments, like give a super, because I've been thinking that, because I knew I would have this task. So, but I think I can wrap it up real quick. So since I'm speaking anyways, so if you remember, in my genealogical discussion, we went back to Warren McCulloch and the nexus of neurophysiology. So in terms of the science of just straight science at the mid 20th century, neurophysiology was really the specialization out of which so much developed along this line, that because of the work of Maturana, because of Francisco's own training in neurophysiology, because that's kind of right. That's the sort of the point at which the soma and the psyche seem just so close you can taste it. If you could just figure out how these little autopoietic entities called nerve cells work. But just really quick, he invented this phrase, experimental epistemology. So that was already McCulloch, as he was trying to work out a logical calculus of mental activity. And it just struck me that this semester we've kind of gone from experimental epistemology as sort of emerging from McCulloch as a mentor to von Förster immediately, and then von Förster kind of working with Maturana and then passing that on to Varela. And then at the far end is enactivism, but with De Paulo's addition of adaptivity as a kind of, and this is what Evan spoke about in his talk, as a necessary supplement to the cognitive side of the total package here. That how experimental epistemology is, if you take it out of context, it becomes a kind of description of enaction. Insofar as an action that we're always kind of probing the world and seeing what works. As we bring the world forth, we see, well, I could bring it forth like that, or I could bring it forth like this. Let me see what happens if I try various assays on my thinking about the world. So that was my little sidewalk insight into how we might tie up some of our threads this semester. That's it. That's what I got.
Beautiful. And then much needed. Thank you for stepping in and giving us that synthetic overview of the voyage we've been on this semester. So I think we will wrap it up there. I don't know if Luisa, did you want to say a couple of words before we transition to the final announcements before we all?
Really, I can always repeat myself in saying I'm very grateful to all of you for making this genealogy season possible. It was a dream for me, an event like this, and I'm really very grateful to see it concrete. Thank you very much for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you to our faculty, and thank you to Luisa, who was instrumental in piloting this entire semester, both conceptually and organizationally. So thank you, Luisa, for bringing us to where we are today.
I'm really grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think we wanted to just announce a couple of upcoming events and say a word about the next semester. So I know a lot of you have expressed interest already in semester 2, in which we'll be undertaking a close reading of the embodied mind. We will be sending out information shortly about the application process, which will occur in January. And we will also be giving more information about the syllabus, the description of the different sessions, and the faculty members. Next semester will begin on February 22nd. And just as we've had a host for this semester, we will have Merrick McGann, who will be hosting next semester, along with at least 5 other faculty members. So we'll be publishing more information about that. And for those of you who are interested in more immediate upcoming events, we have a talk tomorrow at the same time at 6 p.m. as a part of our EVA alumni series with Nina Volbert. This will be the final talk of the series for this season, and then we'll probably pick up again in the spring with more EVA alumni talks. And then next Wednesday at the same time, 6 p.m., we'll have one of our Mind Matters webinars, and this time it'll be with Martine Batchelor, who will be talking about the art of meditative listening and speaking while standing at the edge. So you're welcome to join us for any of these upcoming events, and we really hope to see you back, many of you back for next semester when we start the close reading. Until then, bon voyage, and have an excellent end of the year. Thanks so much.